Hello, and welcome to the Simpler Education Series webcast. Today's webcast is titled Centralizing Credentialing in a Multi-Hospital System with speaker Janice Benggio. At the end of this session, we will have time for a formal Q&A, but feel free to ask as many questions as they come to mind via the chat box located on the right side of your screen. You will be able to download today's webcast archive and its slides at symplr.com soon. You will also receive this download information in an email. The Simpler Education Series is sponsored by Symplr, Compliance and Credentialing for Healthcare. We are so pleased to have Janice as our speaker this month. Janice is a Certified Professional Medical Staff Manager, Certified Provider Credentialing Specialist, and Certified Professional Healthcare Risk Manager. She is currently a project manager for a healthcare organization and a freelance medical staff consultant. She has worked as a medical staff services professional for almost 18 years, having worked in the legal field prior to that. I'd like to turn it over to her now.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you all for joining us today. I had a little bit of experience with centralizing a credentialing department from a multi-hospital system several years ago, so I'll be drawing from some of that success and also from our lessons learned. And we're going to look at the topics for centralizing credentialing, and this is what we'll be going over today. We'll begin with an introduction that examines the differences between decentralized versus centralized credentialing. Why would we consider making such a change? How is this considered to be a project, if it is a project? The type of team that we'll need, considerations about policies, procedures, and the bylaws, discuss technical considerations, look at a data review and cleanup, how would we do that, discuss how verifications can be handled, and consider the benefits for this change and what it would bring to the stakeholders. Ultimately, when you consider centralizing credentialing, the goal is to have an efficient and effective credentialing system that will lead to an improved quality for your providers, and it will maintain your credentialing through data integrity and providing excellent customer service with high quality results. Okay, we can go to this slide with the centralized versus decentralized. So, decentralized versus centralized credentialing. How do we keep working in our silos, and how do we know what resources we want to share and work more efficiently? Well, currently, many hospitals work in organizations. If you're in multi-hospital systems, it's like silos, kind of like the guys in this cartoon. Some of you feel like you know the way to do it best, or we've always done it this way. So if we share resources, though, in a centralized credentialing environment, we can be more effective and efficient. In this cartoon, you'll see some of the barriers that probably currently exist in your organization as well as in most of them. But changing this mindset will build a team where the resources combine to provide a better outcome, ultimately more effective and more efficient credentialing. Okay, next slide, the centralized approach. So, advantages to a centralized approach include performing the verifications once at the centralized unit rather than at each facility. That reduces duplication of efforts, it saves time, it allows you to share resources, and ultimately increase satisfaction for the staff, meaning the medical staff as well as the people that do the credentialing. So when you say resources, that's a catch-all word that we use a lot. But when you consider centralizing, these resources would include the paper that you may use to print out applications or reappointments or whatever reminders you may send, the toner and the cost for using that copier, postage for sending out applications, and of course the manpower of your staff, the manpower of the doctors and their staff for completing applications, and of course time. Time is the biggest factor for money. So efficiency equals money. Next slide. So should this effort be considered a project? Well, a project, loosely defined, would be a collaborative enterprise that is carefully planned and designed to achieve a particular aim. So to start the transition, keep in mind this effort really is a project. The aim or the goal is to bring improved efficiency to credentialing processes, primarily for the hospital system, but of course also for providers that are being credentialed. A project has a start and an end date, so we'll assume that the key individuals have had discussions and have made a decision to follow this path. Therefore, your start date is when you're going to gather your team. You'll collectively decide when is your go-live date. That's the end of the project. And of course, that means the project then becomes an operational procedure after the go-live date. So you'll have a centralized credentialing team at that point. So this is really a project. When you consider doing a project, you may want to think about some Six Sigma or quality tools. You don't have to be an expert or certified in this to understand that by using a SWOT analysis, it could help you greatly. SWOT, S-W-O-T, stands for strength, weakness, opportunities, and threats. So you can Google that, a SWOT analysis, and that'll help you greatly in your planning when you start your project. Keep in mind that you'll strive to have everything in place by your anticipated go-live date, but the team should build in contingencies for unexpected events that could and probably will occur. Of course, good preparation, open sharing of ideas, and transparency are needed in order to reach these team goals. You may even think about that quality acronym, PCDA, Plan, Do, Check, Act. That can be helpful as you proceed after you've done a SWOT analysis and your team begins to work. You may want to implement that PCDA continuous improvement process throughout the project. Okay, next. The centralization or project team, you can call it whatever you'd like, but what are the real purposes for this team? Well, the team has several functions. They're going to answer questions. That could be from the internal customers and the external customers. They're going to provide feedback, again, to both internal and external customers. They're going to solve disputes, make resolutions. They're going to make decisions. Ultimately, someone has to make that decision about how you're going to proceed on each step of the way. And it's helpful to have a good variety of people in your team because you get a different vantage point from everyone's perspective and what their job duties are. Okay, so who would be on that team? Next slide. The first important thing to consider when undergoing a large project like this is the need to create a team of key personnel or stakeholders to facilitate this transition smoothly. So we're going to refer to this as the centralization team, or they might be called a project or project team. Whether it's just a few people or more sizable group will depend on the size of your organization. For example, if you have 3 facilities and maybe 9 medical staff professionals currently working with credentialing, it may be in your best interest to have at least one person from each facility on that team. One person should be the decision maker. You should also include a person from your IT department if you have one, or whoever your technical person is, because they'll be key in helping you to understand and implement those technical changes. You'll also want to include 1 or 2 key medical staff members. Maybe it could be a chief medical officer, member of your credentialing committee, perhaps even a medical executive committee member, but someone who is familiar with credentialing and also a medical staff person. Well, in such a large undertaking, you need the acceptance of the concept from the medical staff as well as their feedback and their perspective. They're going to be your liaison or conduit to carry that message to and from the medical staff. And they may not need to attend all the meetings, your medical staff person, but they at least need to be there as the person that is your resource for medical staff. And of course, by this time, you would have had the approval of your organization to centralize credentialing services. So it's important to keep in mind that when you have a team this large, you want representation from key stakeholders, but you don't want your team too large, because when you get it too large, you have too many opinions, and that could be counterproductive and slow your progress. So just think about that as you're planning who is on your team. Okay, next slide. We couldn't have a team without talking about the dynamics of a team. It's important to understand that making such changes, such as centralizing credentialing from a decentralized process, can bring a lot of emotions, not only from the team, but everybody who is affected by this change. There could be a shift in staffing from the medical staff offices to this new team, and possibly consideration of decreasing staff. However, in my advice, from my experience, it's better not to decrease any staff, at least in the beginning when you're embarking on this project. There will be learning curves for everyone involved. You need to be able to keep up with your deadlines. As you know, they're rotating, and you really never complete any real task in credentialing. Those rotating deadlines keep you on your toes. So you might even consider having someone to help you out with these daily office tasks, just so that the people who are on the team will be able to keep up during the transition. There could be job title changes with increases or decreases in responsibility, and of course the fear of uncertainty that comes with all change. It's important that the team be clear, honest, and sensitive in these matters. Even with a good timeline and justification for how to proceed, there could be external forces that will cause the team to deviate from the original plans. So just be prepared for that and understand that having this centralized team making the changes will be a dynamic process. And although the goal is to improve processes and increase your efficiency, there can be bumps along the way, so you should plan for delays and make sure that you have plenty of time built into your plan. That reminds me of something that someone once told me when I started working in healthcare, and it's true even to this day, and that is the only constant in healthcare is change. So, of course, you have to be able to multitask, don't you? Next slide. Policies and procedures. Well, now that you have your team in place, you should begin working on establishing your formalized framework or the policies or the agreements that will help you move forward. So what do you want to include in those? One policy, probably your primary one, should be authority to give the new department or division the authority to conduct the credentialing function on behalf of all the facilities. This could be called a delegation policy or delegation agreement. It allows the verification of credentials to be performed one time and then shared with the other facilities, and it should be a formalized document. You'll also need to consider the individual facilities' nuances and address how providers will be added to the system, how the providers will be shared with other facilities, who has administrative rights in your new system, who has editorial rights, what are the individual staff duties, such as who does the credentialing initially, who does the reappointments, who does the expirables, and when the providers will go through the credentialing process. We'll talk about that a little bit more later in the slides. So be sure that your policies follow your bylaws requirements. This is very important. For example, the bylaws may state that the reappointment process shall be 2 years after the last reappointment, or it might say not longer than 24 months from the last reappointment or recredentialing. The subtle word differences could mean a difference in how you write your policies, so be sure to carefully review your bylaws when you write the policies. You don't want any conflicts there. Your bylaws might even need to be updated if the process changes will conflict with the current bylaws. And in a multi-hospital system, that could be time-consuming to change the bylaws, so keep that in mind when you consider your time frame. Your bylaws committee and medical executive committee need to be fully aware of the situation and be willing to lead any needed changes through the approval process. And when you work with multiple hospitals, you may have more than one set of bylaws, and you may even have more than one governing body. In such cases where it's more complex that way, you may want to also consult your legal counsel in addition to your bylaws committee. Okay, next slide. Talk a little bit about your forms. You may want to or need to update your forms, because when you centralize, you probably have a new department or a new unit within a department. And this may mean that whatever you're using now with your current multiple addresses will change. So you may think about letterhead that needs to be done, the various forms that you're using for credentialing. That could include your applications, your reference forms, your affiliation verifications. There could be rosters that you use, that you provide to people within your hospital. If you are currently using those for individual hospitals, it may be updated. Reports, you have reports that go to all different locations. So think about your headers and your footers will know how they'll need to be updated. Of course, business cards for any new staff or staff that are transferred to this unit. You may even have a different logo, maybe not, but it depends on whether or not your centralized department is coming from all within the same organization or different organizations. Make sure that you have the correct contact information on everything. One important place to do that is with your malpractice carriers. If they were automatically sending updated malpractice face sheets to the hospital, you'll make sure that they all know this new place to send them to. And if you can, work with your IT or technical department to get a new email address. It would be kind of like a catch-all email address, credentials, credentialing at your hospital name. That way, maybe more than one person could have all the emails that come to that. They can sort them out to wherever it should go. And you may even be able to get a web page or a web page within your organization's current website that would have information and be a sort of explanation for anybody who needs information about the centralized credentialing process or verification of affiliation at your current facilities. Okay, next page. System requirements. So after the credentialing team is in place, it's important the organization has a technology solution that's designed to operate in a centralized fashion. The system should allow for the provider's credentials to be entered at that unit and then easily shared with all the other facilities. And that should be done in real time. You may already have a system that you can use, or you may be looking to upgrade or change your software altogether. It's important that each facility where the provider will be working is able to obtain the verified credentials packet easily. And that would pertain to either an initial application or reappointment application. And these packets are needed by each facility's medical staff so they can present them to their credentials committee, their department chair, and or medical executive committee. And in today's fast-paced environment, a good credentialing software will allow for all of these steps to be web-based, therefore providing the ability for meetings to also be held virtually. Of course, your bylaws should state whether or not virtual meetings are allowed or prohibited. In other words, committee members may be able to log into the software from anywhere they have an internet access, and they could review and or approve somebody, make comments, and they can see the completed credentials packet online. And that's one less physical meeting that perhaps you can have. And this is really a great convenience for the doctors who are doing review because you know that they have such limited time anyway. So it's wonderful when you can create this value-added feature for them. One thing to consider when you're choosing credentialing software, if you're getting new software, is the administrative features of it. So staff at all facilities should have the ability, of course, to see the work, but also to be able to see only their hospital so that they don't have to look at all of it at one time if it's for multiple hospitals. And you should be able to allow certain staff to have editing capabilities and certain staff that you would only want to have view-only capabilities. For instance, you may have a group of clinical staff that they need to see all of the privileges that people have, but they don't need to see the provider's cell phones and their personal demographics. So that's an example of where you may want to be able to limit what people can see. And don't forget about the providers themselves having access, the physicians, the allied health staff. When I say providers, I'm including both of those groups. They want to be able to view their own information, and they need to be able to make updates as needed. And of course, you can decide when the time is right for that. When you centralize credentialing, that may not be something that you want to do initially, but it could be after your transition, after your staff is trained to do the credentialing, and they're comfortable with it, you may want to add that feature then later for the physicians and the allied staff. Okay, next slide. The data review, planning, and implementing. The next step in creating a centralized or shared structure is consolidating your provider's information. It's important to understand what data your organization currently has and make a plan to consolidate it. Your centralized team will not only have to make some choices, generally speaking, but this will be a very important and time-consuming process but if it's performed incorrectly in the beginning, it could cause a lot of issues on the back end. So I would say spend all the time that you need on this part of it so that the later part will be easier. This is also where your IT or technical members will be very valuable to the team. They may be able to assist if you're having to export data from one credentialing software application into another. They may be able to export data into tables so that the new data, the cleaned up data, would be able to be loaded from the back end. It'll save a lot of time. And you probably already know this, but when you have staffing changes over the years, and many, many people have worked on your organization's files, whether by paper or electronically, there's going to be a lot of differences in the way data has been entered and recorded. So now is the right time to decide specifically how you want this data to be entered. Next slide. We'll talk a little bit now about data cleansing and normalization. You'll hear some of these words with different softwares and as you go through this process, but basically it means having a standardized way to enter your data and use that data. You see a couple of examples here. You may see states' initials. Sometimes they were entered years ago as 3 letters. Now most people enter them as 2 letters without a period at the end. And this may seem very difficult and detail-oriented, but it's very helpful. It not only provides consistency and a professional appearance, but you also have normalized data, which will be a tremendous asset to you when you run your reports. For example, if you wanted to find every doctor who had a home whose address was in Alabama, it's easier to run a report looking for simply AL than to look for it spelled different ways. Another way to think about this is if you wanted to run a report for all your anesthesiologists. Well, you wouldn't want to have to run a report where you filtered out anesthesia, pediatric anesthesia, anesthesiology. The more you can combine and standardize these words, the better it will be for you. A great way to keep your data normalized after you've made this cleanup is to make a list. What do you consider in your organization to be acceptable? And what do you consider to be non-acceptable? And then train your staff, whoever is going to do the data entry, so that they understand the importance of it and will follow that list that you've made. Print that list. It's important to keep this at every workstation. I'm not one to waste a lot of paper and printing, but I feel like that this is one of the most important things that you can print and keep for handy reference, because when you start going quickly, you may forget, and if you start on this train of entering it incorrectly, it's more difficult to go back later and clean it up. So the end goal when you do data normalization and cleanup is to have one electronic record for each provider that's on your staff and works for your organization, and that the data is consistently entered the way you've decided you want it to look for your organization. So, putting that plan into action. As mentioned, normalizing data from multiple hospitals can take time from already busy schedules. So, plan who can do this. Are you going to use your current staff? Are you going to train volunteers? Maybe you might even think about contracting staff if you've got a whole lot of data that needs to be cleaned up from multiple hospitals. If you had only a few hospitals, you might be able to do it within your current staff. If you're using existing staff, you may want to set aside particular hours of a day or of the week to work on the project. And you know, you have to kind of laugh when you say, is there a slower time of the year? Because in medical staff and credentialing, there's really not a true slow time. But the winter might be a good time to do it because spring and summer are typically a little bit busier as residents are completing their training. So you may want to think about this and plan for your organization when is the best time of the year. And since this is somewhat monotonous when you're doing data cleanup, just remember to keep a positive attitude, and knowing that the end result will make life easier for everyone involved will really be helpful. The supervisor or team leader may even want to offer some sort of incentive to keep the staff engaged and focused on that end result. Incentives can be very small. They can be tokens of appreciation from a verbal thank you or recognition more formally in front of your supervisor, maybe the medical staff, certificates, a lunch out, or maybe even your newsletter. But think about that these people that are going to do this will work very hard to make it cleaned up and presentable, and you want to make sure that you recognize them and thank them for those efforts. Okay, next slide. The data review, consolidation, and cleanup. This is a table that is a little bit busy, but if you get the presentation later, you can keep this and look through it a little bit more. If your organization is like the earlier example of a facility or an organization that has 3 facilities, then you'll have 3 instances of one provider's data, and there's no guarantee that each instance is going to be the same. Additionally, the data, whether it's electronic, paper, or a combination of the two, along with whether you're keeping your current system or moving to a new system, will play a huge role in the steps your organization will take to cleanse this data. And the chart shows you how you may want to approach this data entry for each file, depending on whether you're using electronic or a combination of electronic paper or strictly paper. Basically, you'll want the most accurate and complete record as the one that you keep, and delete the duplicates of records that are not as complete or not as accurate. You may have to manually enter some of these records. You'll want to run an audit report before going live to make sure that the records appear to be complete. In fact, you may want to run audit reports several times. As you make cleanup through the records, you can run these reports and then filter by different fields, and that will help you see more quickly which areas may still need some cleanup. Okay, next. Verification of credentials. So good old ROI, return on investment. This is the main area where the organization will see the biggest return on investment, which saves time and money for the organization. Keeping our earlier example that we referred to as the legacy or decentralized approach, a provider working at 3 facilities within the same organization means that each one of those facilities would verify all of the exact same items on that provider. Each facility would verify static information, such as medical training and past employment, as well as dynamic information, such as licensure, DEA, board certification, and so on. In your new centralized approach, that verification of credentials is performed just one time, and then the results are shared with every facility where the provider will be working. That can save a lot of time, as well as paper, toner, postage, all those other things that we talked about, our human resources, our paper resources, whatever it is that's costing you money. So this is where you can show value for your organization. Next page. Talk about workload division. It's an important feature for the centralized team to determine, before you, of course, go live, to determine how your workload is going to be divided. And this, of course, is also dependent on the medical size, the medical staff size, and your organization size. One way you can think about dividing the teams is by functions. In other words, some employees will be responsible for initial appointments. Those would probably be your credentialers that are very detail-oriented, your investigators. Other employees will be responsible for reappointments, and these people will get to know your staff very well because they're going to be the ones who work on the reappointments from one term to the next. You may have other people that handle miscellaneous requests or be responsible for managing your expirables. Another option would be consideration of a production type division. In this, you would have employees that would verify maybe the education. Some others may verify licenses, DEAs. And of course, if you want to do something like this, it depends on how big your organization is. In a very large organization, this might be helpful. Another way to divide the workload would be by specialty. And that could be a couple of people that work on internal medicine, family medicine, your primary care providers. Or you could have somebody who works on OBGYN, pediatrics, neonatology, those type specialties. Or you may want to have somebody who does all of the allied health professionals and becomes very familiar with what's required for their credentialing. Or another way to divide that is to have your hospital-based services such as emergency medicine, radiology, pathology, anesthesiology, all done by the same person. And if you have size groups that would allow for that, that could be very attractive. And another approach could be by the provider's last names. You could have someone who takes all providers A to C. but I would caution if you try to do something like that, you still would probably want to divide up between appointments and reappointments, and based on your credentialer's experience, how you might consider this. The team should carefully study which method would be best for your organization because you want to balance this workload as fairly as possible. It would not ever be exactly even, but you don't want one person to have significantly more or significantly less than another person. And you can try to get this as best as you can in the beginning, but just from experience, you may need to tweak it later on after you start going. Okay, next. Reappointment dates. Another important consideration when centralizing credentialing is the re-credentialing dates, also referred to as reappointment dates or appointment expiration dates. And the reason for this, of course, is because if you're working in a Joint Commission accredited facility, the provider cannot go longer than 2 years without a reappointment. And since your organization has probably been decentralized up to this point, those dates will probably be different at every facility where they're working. To capitalize the most on the transition, it's important to note that the nearest date per provider among the facilities and then credential them on or before that date. Once that verification is complete, you may then push the credentials packet to each of the facilities to be reappointed at all facilities at the same time. Of course, you'll need the approval of the medical staff to make that work, and some will be credentialed before the end of their next 2-year reappointment cycle. You may have doctors that complain that they just got reappointed 3 months ago, so why am I being reappointed again? Communication is good here to make sure that they understand that when you transition from decentralized to centralized, yes, they will probably be reappointed one time that is closer than 2 years, but from that point on, they only have one reappointment date. Ideally, the medical staff will agree to having a centralized credentials committee, knowing that each facility would first need the centralized packet reviewed by their department chief or chair before it goes to that committee, if you use a credentials committee. Subsequently, each facility would then be on the same reappointment cycle. So, in just closing, there's some key points to think about here. The main reason for doing this, of course, is so that you're going to have quality providers through a consistent process of credentialing. By doing that, you will increase revenue and decrease expenditures. You'll decrease workload for your staff and for your providers. You'll provide more time for other medical staff functions. And of course, by doing these things, it does improve provider relations. So it's typically a win-win for your organization, your staff, your providers, and of course, the patients. So on behalf of symplr, I thank you for taking your time out of your busy schedule to participate in the webcast, and I wish you much success if you're considering this journey to centralized process for your organization. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have after this commercial break.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And now we're going to pause for a brief commercial break to talk about symplr as it relates to this topic. symplr has a provider credentialing solution for any and all medical credentialers. It provides easy online application for providers, automated expiration monitoring and sanction screening, dynamic customizable forms and letters, automated workflows, and powerful reporting. If this sounds like something that would benefit your facility, please contact us at sales@symplr.com. That's sales@symplr.com. And now please join us for a Q&A with Janice. If you haven't done so already, please ask your questions in the chat box and we will get to as many as we can. We would also like to remind everyone that we will be providing a link via email for an archive of this webcast and to download its slides. To ensure that you get that email, please add communications@symplr.com to your email address.